Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
Good Saturday afternoon out there, everyone. Welcome to your number one source for Native American television news, Muskogee Vision. I am your host, Jason Salzman, and we have a great show lined up for you today. Lots of things to get to. Really exclusive, nice interview I got for you here from a very good writer that put a interesting piece on the Tulsa World. We're going to have that. We'll also take a look at some other things that have been happening here in and around Muskogee Creek Nation this last week. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this first break with Muskogee Vision.
I was having a real hard time and a lot of stress in my family. I felt like I didn't want to live anymore, like I couldn't take it anymore. I went to a psychiatric hospital for a few days, gathered my thoughts, and got some medication for my depression and anxiety. I started going to behavioral health for counseling, learned better ways to communicate and talk to my family, and healthy ways to cope with my feelings. If I hadn't got any help, I might not be here now.
I know when you know someone who is struggling that they may think there is no one to listen. I lost my son, Tyler, to suicide. Don't wait to ask the question. Be direct. Ask your loved one, are you thinking of taking your life? Ask before it's too late.
And welcome back to the program. As we get started this week, our first feature is with the Muskogee Creek Nation Citizenship Office, as they are now going to be offering this coming week. You can get started getting your enhanced tribal ID card. Now what this is, it's not a citizenship card, but it is a card that you can pay a fee for, get in an application process and receive, and it's basically like a passport. You can use it as a passport to travel, things like that. And we talked to Citizenship about these new enhanced tribal ID cards.
The enhanced tribal card that we're issuing, it's an optional card. It's separate from the citizenship card that's issued right now. And this one, it basically acts as the equivalent of a passport card through Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol. The issuing date is going to be September 10th. That's when we're going to be doing our first process for applications and interviews. The process of getting it is for all Muskogee Creek citizens. They're eligible to apply for that. They will need to update their citizenship files, so they'll need to be sure to bring their state certified birth certificate, the original, not a copy, and if they're over the age of 18, their driver's license and their or a state ID, and then also a social security card for themselves. There is going to be an interview process. That's reason for the appointments, to make sure to call the Jinx office and get their appointment scheduled. That way, once they bring their documents, then we can go ahead and go through their interview process at that time. That way it'll already be scheduled. And it's 10 questions out of a 35 queue of questions. It's just basic information as far as their family history, or based on their birth certificates and things. And then for the first card that's being issued, the application fee is $45, and then replacements will be $25, depending on what situation, as far as lost or stolen or things like that, for replacements. again, it is equivalent to the passport card, so one of the main benefits for it is that it's going to be able to allow a citizen to travel to the borders between Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, and it allows them land or sea access through those borders. And the card also has additional technologies as far as the RFID, which allows an individual to come up to those borders and the Customs and Border Patrol to have their information already ready for them to view. That way it'll give them a more accessible avenue to go through the borders.
And the Citizenship Office will be able to help you out if you want to get an enhanced tribal ID card coming up this week. So get in contact with them. Go to the Muskogee Creek Nation homepage to see their contact information, and they'll get you hooked up. Well, the city of Tulsa has a rich history. A lot of that history starts with the Muskogee people, the Lochaboga people. They're at the Council Oak Tree in downtown. That's where they started everything. But the history of Gathering Place now sits on Muskogee Creek land as well. And we talked with a gentleman that did a story recently about that history. Tulsa native Russell Cobb is a writer and academic who is currently a professor in cultural studies at the University of Alberta. He's had work featured in everything from Oklahoma's This Land Press to the New York Times. He recently had an article appear in the Tulsa World regarding the new Gathering Place Park and its relation to historic Muskogee figure Tuckabutchee. Yeah. Well, it's great to have you on the program. I know recently, the reason we wanted to have you on the program is you appeared in the Tulsa World talking about the Gathering Place and the fact that it's this nice big park. Yes, but there are some Muskogee roots, some deep Muskogee roots in the land on which it sits. Kind of talk to us a little bit about how you came to writing this article. I know you've got some other projects too, but how did you come to write this article and really what led you to it being published?
Right. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for having me. I just, this is such a passionate issue for me because I grew up literally a block from the Gathering Place, and what we call it Maple Ridge now. It was originally not Maple Ridge at all, but and it was a real experience to learn the origins of that land and who it belonged to and the longer history, because I knew nothing about it growing up. No one ever spoke of it at all. And I met a J.D. Colbert, and he told me when I was working on a piece about the Gathering Place, he said, you want to look into a guy named Tuckabutchee. And so I started to research Tuckabutchee and his roots into the land, and that led me on a longer quest to find out more about allotment and the dissolution of the tribal nations around the time of statehood. And that just, it's so shocking to me to know that I never learned that in school, and to really learn it, that I was shocked and then also concerned when I learned more about the Gathering Place and learned that, we've got this thing sponsored by Williams and this thing sponsored by Quick Trip and all these oil companies, but nothing, as far as I could tell, honoring the Muskogee Nation or Tuckabutchee in particular.
Right, and I think, you're in education, higher education, but no doubt. You came up in Tulsa, as you said, educated there, and you talk to other people in the world of academia, I'm sure. As an educator, how disheartening is that to think about now that generations of Tulsans are growing up not really knowing about the true or the original history of their city?
Yeah, it's really disappointing. I mean, I think we're taking the first baby steps forward, and that's promising. For example, I went to, like a lot of people in Maple Ridge, I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary School. That's now been renamed in honor of the Council Oak tree. And those are little steps that we take and we start to rediscover. And I really find that people of my generation, and especially younger, have a hunger for learning this history, because, like somebody said, a writer once said, when you start to learn about Oklahoma history and about some of the crimes that took place that were foundational to our state, which I still love. You know, I'm from Oklahoma. I don't live there anymore, but I still love Oklahoma. But when you start to learn about those foundational crimes, it changes almost the way you relate to yourself and your own identity. It feels like this place is not what I thought it was. And so I think that it's really important for the Gathering Place. You know, it may not be the best PR in the world, but it's very important for them to acknowledge that history and that land so that we start to move, we incrementally move this process forward.
Yeah, and I know that the tribes were invited out, were a part of the Gathering Place's opening. I know some of the, I think some of the representatives from public relations went out there and everything like that. So I can't speak to maybe if there's something in play or if something's going to happen there. I'll certainly have to ask them about that. But I think you make a great point that it is kind of turning, the tide is turning a little bit in favor of more recognition and more education on Oklahoma's real history. Now, you said a writer was talking about Oklahoma history. You, sir, are yourself a writer that's going to be talking about some Oklahoma history. I know you're excited about a book that you're working on. It's going to be a little while before it's out yet, and we'll talk to you then again when it is so we can talk about that a little bit more. But I know that you're diving into some Oklahoma history right now, and it's got to be pretty fascinating for you. I'm sure that we all know a lot, us that research, but you probably uncovered some things even that you weren't aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the things are, we know, and I'm sure anyone who's done a little bit of a, who's bothered to take a little bit of a cursory look into Oklahoma history realizes that it comes out of some pretty dark places in terms of the swindles that happen of native land. But look, it comes out of a pretty conflictive world. But what's really shocked me, what's really blown me away is once I learned about Tuggabuggie's land, I started to look at other lands. And so I have been meeting with some descendants of people whose allotments were taken. And I mean, not in the distant past of the old Wild West. I'm talking about in courts with lawyers by people whose names are still on the faces of public buildings, of schools, airports, that were instrumental in, what our wonderful state historian Angie Debo called a vast criminal conspiracy. And she was a woman who did not mince words, and I don't think she would have said that if it were anything less than that. And it really was a vast criminal conspiracy that was conducted right in by the leading men of Oklahoma. And so once I started to see that it wasn't just this one isolated case of Tuggabudgie, but for example, there was a big case of the Naharkey allotments, the Naharkey family, who had a big part of West Tulsa, 3 different generations of them whose lands were taken because they were actually kidnapped. And for example, one of the girls, she was 17 in 1922, and she was abducted by one of the men of a leading oil man in Tulsa, and abducted and harassed and assaulted until she agreed to sign over the deed to her land. And I couldn't believe this, and I couldn't believe that there was nothing written about it. I mean, there was a lot written about it in the 1920s, but not in my work has been real archival work. I mean, in the most basic sense. You can't Google it. You can't Google it. You have to go to the National Archives. You have to request, and you have to see the records of probate cases to see the paper trail of what happened. And when you start to see it, like, for example, you see the way the white guardians came in and would just have people sign an X and deed over their lands for sometimes pennies. Then those guardians would turn around and flip those very same lands for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, that is just shocking, right? And the thing is that's not just the distant past. And that's one of the things I really want to emphasize, and I want to emphasize in the book, is we might think, well, okay, well, that was 80 years ago, 90 years ago, even 100 years ago, but now we're living in a different reality. Well, we're still just like we were in the 20s, the teens and 20s. we still have an economy that has a lot to do with oil, right? The wealth of the oil industry. And that didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of that original crime. Now, I'm not so presumptuous to say what I think, that I have all the answers about what should be done about that. But the first step forward is certainly at least acknowledging it and discussing it and teaching it in schools. And then we can start to have a real honest conversation about where to go from there.
That's an excellent point you bring up there, Russell. And also, I was going to ask you, whenever you were putting together some of your thoughts and some of your material to put that piece out in the Tulsa world, was there any conversations at all that you had, I wonder, with officials of the Gathering Place, people putting it up, that might lead to you thinking there may be a chance that they are going to give a nod to that history?
Right. I did. Yeah. I mean, I spoke with Jeff Staba, who's the executive director of the park, and he said there are ongoing conversations. He didn't go into details. He said, as you mentioned, Jason, that there was a blessing by some tribal elders that was a private ceremony, and that they have an ongoing conversation about doing something that he said was, I'm trying to make sure I get his words exactly right, meaningful. He said he didn't want to just have a plaque or something, but something meaningful. And so I thought that was promising. I think that's the right thing to do. But I mean, we've had this. But here's the thing: like, we've had this park in the works for what, 2014, 2015, maybe.
It's been a project, yeah.
It's getting ready to open in a few days. Like, why is that not ready to go? I mean, they've been able to secure multi-million-dollar donations, have play structures, state-of-the-art play structures created in Germany and shipped over. Why are we just now starting to get down and talk about what do we do about the fact that this land was for generations pertained to Takabachi, not just Takabachi, but he raised his son. He raised grandchildren there. It was a farm. It was, all kinds of people came through. When the railway came through, he was an old man already, and he really resented that. He tried to fight it in court because it was on his land. He said, I don't want the railroad coming through my land. And they basically swindled him in court and said, no, you leased it to this guy. He said, he didn't know what, he didn't speak English, so he didn't know what he was leasing, and that happened a lot, right?
Right, yeah.
And so he would try to fight that in court, and he lost, and it went straight through where he used to hunt and fish and that sort of thing. So, I've said, and I know some other indigenous people have said, maybe a start is to talk about that trail that now follows that old MKT railroad line. It's now called the Midland Valley Trail, and it's a wonderful resource. A lot of people walk their dogs and ride their bikes. Maybe we should call that Takabachi Trail.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start there.
Yeah, and I think, talking about it too, that reminds me, you had shared a piece of history, actually. I think it was from the early 20s, maybe, an article that described Takabachi as a surly old man, I think is what it said. I thought that was great. Sullen, I'm sorry, Sullen. And because he was just not having it.
Sullen old Indian.
Old Indian, yeah.
Sullen old Indian holds fort.
He wasn't having it. He was upset, and he wanted people to know, even if he couldn't, tell them that. I'm sure he told it to them in his Muskogee language, but they probably didn't understand what he was saying. So
yeah, and he was widely known. He wasn't just some guy out there in the boonies.
Sure.
Like, he was connected to all these things. That was an amazing thing for me, as a non-native person, was to learn. I kind of learned a lot of that part of removal and then the Civil War and territory days and statehood through Takabachi. Like, it's amazing because he lived through all of it. He was born in the Southeast, experienced removal, fought for the Union, by the way. When much of the tribe sided with the Confederacy, Takabachi was one of the leaders with Opis Yohola and siding with the loyal Creeks that went there, and so that's somebody who definitely we should be thinking about honoring, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And
Yeah, the Takabachi, you talk to any Creek that knows the history, very prominent figure, definitely, not only in our history, but the city of Tulsa as well, and somebody that I think, everyone in Tulsa should know the story of Takabachi, certainly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's crazy that we have this divide too. I mean, we've got lots of divides in Tulsa, but one is that this is a story that's well known among Creek people, and I'd be willing to bet that there are maybe one, maybe two other people in the whole neighborhood of Maple Ridge that have heard that name. I've tried. I've reached out a million times. I said, "Have you ever heard of this?" I've talked to people who've lived there for 40 years. They said, "No, we just know." And this is a funny story. They said, "No, we just know that in our deed to the property, there's a cloud because of the quote unquote dead Indian."
Right.
They just know that there was a dead Indian that's clouding their title to the land. And I said, well, he's not just some dead Indian. He has a name, and he has a history, and he has a very prominent history. So, yeah.
Well, we certainly thank you, Russell, for coming on and sharing some of that history with us today, and really sharing it with Tulsa, and putting such an article in the Tulsa World that I thought was highly educational, but more so, it felt like, the time is right for somebody to step forward and put together an article like this. So we would certainly thank you for that, just as native citizens, but also as a journalist. It was neat to see and neat to jump into some of your other writings too. And we're really going to be excited to see your book come out whenever it's ready. So we'll let you get back to work on that. How about that?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Yeah. I really appreciate it, Jason. This has been fantastic, and thanks for the opportunity to come talk to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Russell. A fascinating history there and to talk about for sure. And we want to thank Russell Cobb there for coming on with us at the University of Alberta. And he's a great reference. He's got some great information out there. So if you Google him, see some of the other things he's written specifically in Tulsa materials about the land, everything like that. A lot of great material there, and he does a fantastic job. I want to thank him for coming on with us. In a bit of sad news to share with you all, folks, we had a loss here at Muskogee Creek Nation this past week. Our Secretary of Interior Affairs, Mr. Ben Cheney, who's had a long history of service to the Muskogee Creek Nation, really an important figure in getting the transit system that we have set up now at Muskogee Creek Nation today. It hasn't always been as sophisticated and as nice and going to pick folks up and getting them where they need to be as it is today. A lot of that had to do with Mr. Cheney. Unfortunately, he passed away. So we wanted to share, just a few months ago, we were able to sit with him and profile really his service to the nation and his job.
I've been around the Creek Nation for several years, since 1999, and I kind of know what was going on. When Mr. Tiger was elected chief, he reorganized, and I ended up, moving on with the others, and I spent the last 4 years working for the Kalaji tribe, now Wetumpka. But Chief called me one day and asked me if I'd be interested in doing this, and if I'd known what he's talking about. It's a big responsibility, but I can see that it's going to work out for me as well as for those different departments. I've had a chance already to visit with all of the department heads, and I will now go back to each individual, and we'll kind of go over the details of what they're doing. So that's at this point, that's what's needed to be done. That's what I'm trying to do, is kind of pull everybody together here, because there's several departments that work under me. So being responsible for each of those departments is a challenge. Well, federal roads is one. The roads department, transit department, which basically back in '99 I kind of started the program of the federal roads and transportation and transit. And I started the transit in 2003, and it has grown since I left here. And now we've got a couple of issues, and I'll discuss with them about the transit, and because I started it for the better of our people. I'm so new here. This is my second week, so those kinds of things I'll have to be brought up to date on. I'm aware of it, but at this point I need to work with Realty to get the details so I know how to follow up with that. But it's just part of the challenge is learning, and it's a big learning curve there. So. Well, there's a couple of things I've been interested in, even when I was not here. And, there's a couple of things that need to be paid attention to. One of them is an air lease for the property out front. It's called an airspace lease. And I had negotiated with the Federal Highway Department to give us that portion for something that was really interesting to them. So there's some details about that now I think probably were not completed. So I'll be looking into that pretty close too. Arbor care is that's another big interest because there's a lot of our people there that needs that service. I took advantage of it last year, and it was really nice to, they come out and trim the trees and the bushes, and and they do a good job. And we need to extend that services more to the people. So, we do a lot of things in each of those departments. But that's really, other than all of it, there's a lot to do. But I will probably, look first into some of those that I've already mentioned and see how we can improve on those.
Again, we just want to extend our condolences to the Cheney family. I know a lot of them. It's a great family and a family that's had a lot to do with Muskogee Creek Nation over the years. And so we want to send out our heartfelt condolences to all of the Cheney family. And he'll have big shoes to fill in his cabinet position. We want to thank you all for joining us here. We want to remind you to go and subscribe to our online channel. Just search Muskogee Media on YouTube and we'll get it. Hit that red button. For Jared Moore and myself, Jason Salzman, you all have a great week. We'll see you next time.